My name is Robin Haddo. I am a freelance fantasy user interface motion graphic artist for film and TV. I've had the pleasure of working on somewhere upwards of 35 different productions, of which some of my favorite include Ant-Man and the Wasp, that just came out a few weeks ago, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and Spider-Man Homecoming. So I have put together a short edit of some of the work that my really good friends, Deca Digital, aka Corey Bramwell, and Scott Higgs, they're both made it out of work to be here in the audience with us today. So we'll take a look at some of the process of Ant-Man and the Wasp. Thank you very much. All right, I call this presentation Building Assets for Production because I'm going to be breaking down some of the tech that I made in Ant-Man and the Wasp, specifically in Hank Pym's lab. Some of the tools that I used to create this, some of the main modifiers behind this are the XParticles network node, alongside some of the MoGraph features, which include polyeffects, shader effector, random effector, as well as some spline-based cloner-driven nulls. So let's take a look at the clip we will be breaking down. Here we have what I call the spatial anomaly matrix. And the concept for this screen was to come up with some kind of circuitry that sort of lived beyond the tech of the suit and was sort of like the inner workings and some sort of like underlying technological heartbeat for the superheroes. So as I said, the main modifier behind this out of XParticles was the network node modifier, and I used polyeffects, shader effector, random effector. And for all of those flipping icons, I exported some of the 3D spatial data from Cinema inside, for use inside of After Effects. So let's take a look at how I made the inner circuitry. Just so you're familiar and you can get an overview of what my Cinema scene file looks like, here is the animation sequence in full inside of my Cinema viewport. As you can see, everything runs in real time. It's super fast and it's super light, which is why I love working with splines and specifically the hair renderer, which you'll hear me talk a lot about today. So let's take a look at how the inner circuitry was built. Gonna open up a new scene file, and drop in an XParticles system object. Here I'm just going to disable the icon in viewport so we don't have to look at the logo for the duration of our scene. and I'll just play out our emitter in its default state. We're going to go into the emissions tab and change my emission mode from rate to shot. I'm going to want to turn my shot count down to something like 24, and so you can so you have a little bit better of so you can see it better for everybody in the audience here. I'm going to change my editor display from dots to circles. So now you can see how my particles are working correctly, and I'm just going to change my timeline here to give us a few more frames to work with, something like 20 seconds. So you can see how my particles emitting exactly how I want in 124 shot count. So now that we have that, I'm going to add a trails generator in the generators tab, trails, and pipe in my emitter in the emitter dropdown. If I hit Shift F and F8 to refresh, then play my scene file, we can see now how the trails object is drawing out the particle path of my emitter, of my emission sprites, which is exactly what I want. So now that I see that I have a sort of live draw effect happening, I thought it's time for the network modifier, because I knew that the network modifier, how it works is it lets particles move in a 3D grid-like fashion, and because I was referencing circuitry, I thought that this would be a great place to start. So we'll go into my modifiers tab, and under the motion modifier tab, I'll add a network node. We'll hit Shift F and F8, and bam, right away, this is the 3D grid-like movement that I was hoping for. And as I was sitting there and I was watching the particles draw out, it's kind of meditative and calm as you see them sort of moving along their splines. And it was kind of like a hypnotic. I really, really liked the pace. But knowing that I was creating a piece of playback, the number one requirement for this is that everything has to loop. So I thought, well, this is not exactly going to work for those needs. And also, I found that the paths, if I pull back in my viewport a bit, they're just sort of drawing out themselves into infinity. So while that was cool, I knew that I needed a way to control my spline paths. So I began to explore some of the options that were offered inside the XP network node, and the operation that I stumbled upon was called inside volume. And the inside volume operation is really, really powerful, because how it works is it lets you pipe any piece of geometry that you want inside of the inside volume channel, and which I will go ahead and do right now. Let's use a cube and drop my cube inside the inside volume objects tab. I'll just disable the cube from my viewport, hit Shift F and play through the scene. And now as my simulation is playing out, you can see that my spline paths are being contained inside the boundary of my cube, which is perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. And also a sort of happy accident that came out of this was you can see that the circuitry that's now being generated is creating a more dense and a more complex looking path, which then led me to believe, like, what if this sort of underlying piece of technology was, we were looking at it through like a keyhole, and it was just a slice into this like massive technological heartbeat, and you only get to see a peak. So the thinking behind that was then, how can I sort of was actually now missing those the boundaries that were sort of drawing out into infinity, and I sort of liked the composition actually that we saw. And so I thought, well, how can I achieve that sort of keyhole peek into something bigger effect? So I made editable, I baked down this live simulation. The other factor being that I knew that I needed to make a loop, and this live draw was just playing out in more of a refresh fashion. So I'll right-click on my system object and say current state to object, wherein it bakes out, it makes a copy, and it bakes out my simulation into a rendered spline. So now I was playing with my, actually I have it open, so we're going through like a cooking show version here. I had baked out my simulations of my standard operation network node simulations, as well as my inside volume mode. So you can see that I have the combination of the simulation where my live draw was growing beyond the bounds of the cube, and it gave this really nice, beautiful, like dense, concentrated 3D grid that could serve as the main circuitry for the slice that we were going to display. So I sort of was like, well, what am I going to do with this? Like, wow, this looks super cool. I knew that I needed a loop, and this is exactly how it happened. I was just toggling around the viewport, and I really, really liked all of the different geometric lines that all the various compositions from looking at it essentially through different camera angles. So first thing first, I was like, okay, let's check one of my must-haves off the list, and let's lay down some keys and build my basis, my loop basis out of the camera move. So I dropped a camera into the scene, parented it to a null, and keyframed some position and rotation properties. Aha, whew, out of Dodge, I've got my loop. Therefore, I knew that this was something that I could actually use. But now when I was looking at this, like we saw in when the simulation was live, even though they were just for display, I really missed the look of the particles following, or as it were, drawing out on the spline. And I felt, if you look at this, it feels a little bit flat. I wanted to have, if we're talking about a technological heartbeat, where's the pulse? So the answer to that, I thought, was a cloner object. I'll put a cloner object into the scene, and what I really, really love about the cloner object when you are working with splines in object mode is that it opens up a whole secret other palette that you get access to. So I'll put my cloner into object mode, and I'll drop my main network. Spline into the object tab, and I'll just hit Shift-C and grab a null object. If in my customized layout, it's always living up here in my toolbar, because that is my #1 go-to inside of Cinema. I don't do anything without a null object, so we have to have that right where you need it. So we'll nest that under my cloner, and now you can see I'll make my sphere, or I'll make my null display a little bit bigger so you can see it. And now you can see that in the object mode, when I pipe my network spline into there, right away, look at all the verts that I have on my spine. There's so many. So the cloners are going to each one of those verts, which I thought was cool, but in this instance, it's now taken away from the point of the scene, and sort of what I'm trying to tell you is going to be the beauty is the inner circuitry. So what I do in the cloner mode is I'll take off the per segment, and now it gives me access to, or it disables going onto all of the verts, and it gives me access to a global count on my spline, wherein I can have a controlled number. In this case, let's take 20, so it's something that it's a little bit more manageable and we can see. And also within the spline, when working with splines in the object mode, is it opens up this rate slider, which is really, really awesome, because if you put a rate value that's divisible of your timeline, there and again you can have a looping effect with your particles. Now the other thing too is if you want to be a little bit more particular about the placement of where your particles are in your scene when cloning onto the spline, is that you can play with this offset slider that lets you, or gives you the ability to art direct the placement of your particles a little bit more. So now I knew that I was going to be attaching something to these nulls inside of After, some sort of a graphic. And I wasn't exactly sure what that was going to be at this point, but as a safety, I always like to take out whatever information I can from Cinema and bring it into After Effects so I have options. And in order to do that, we'll just right-click onto our Cinema 4D tags, add an external compositing tag, make sure that children is enabled so we get all of our 20 clones that we stipulated in our object mode. And in our render output settings, in the save settings, you have to make sure that the save checkbox and the include 3D data checkbox is enabled for your .aec file export. So the other thing is that by default, the splines do not render out of Cinema. We're just looking, we can just see these splines in our viewport. So how are we going to visualize that? And again, my go-to, another one of my go-tos is the hair render engine in Cinema because it's so fast. It's so light, and you can generate results in less than a second. So what I'll do is I'll just erase my tags that I had previously on there. I'll select both of my splines, right-click onto my hair tags, and throw down a render tag, which automatically puts it into align mode, which is going to work in our purpose. And I'm going to create a new shader hair material that we'll turn off the specular, and here you have access to customize your thickness. Let's choose something like 0.8 as a starting point, as well as you can customize your color. You don't have to be so picky or particular at this point with the color because we can take care of all that sort of stuff inside of After Effects. But just to keep it consistent and do something nice, I will put I made a thicker and a thin, one with a thicker root value and one with a thinner root value, and we'll put each respectively on a spline. So now when I hit render, you can see the hair renderer in action, and that is what will be exported out of Cinema and into After Effects. So let's take a quick look at at the piece of playback we are recreating at the moment. And as you can see, the nulls that I assigned the compositing tag to, I made a flipping animation, like a flipping icon sequence inside of After Effects, and attached a little tag to it that is describing its 3D spatial data to make it look like it's actively calculating and returning values of where all of the nodes are going. So think back to our viewport, those splines, those hair splines looked a little flat. And what I sort of, again, and when I sort of criticizing what I was doing going through the process here, I thought, well, how do we know? This was if we look at my scene here and we play, like, how do we know how do we describe, this looks very flat. How do we know where all of the circuits, how do we infer that it's a part of a bigger environment? And I felt like we needed to have some texture in there and texture in 3D space to infer part of the environment and what that would look and feel like. So I started to play around with what sort of a cage or a light textured dimensional cage element could look like. And like most things in Cinema, it all started with a cube. So I'll drop a cube into my scene, and I'll just hit NB so we can see it in, I'll just hit NB so we can see everything in wireframe mode. And actually, so you just don't have to look at gray on gray, we'll use a color, and I like yellow. Yellow is my favorite color. So let's make it orange. Orange is my second favorite color. That's better. We'll go into our object mode, and just so we have more access to more polygons to play with, I'm going to change my segments up to a value of 10. Holding down Control, you can pipe in the same value to all 3 of your channels. And with my cube still selected, I'll hold down Shift and drop PolyEffects MoGraph modifier as a child of my cube. And this is what gives me access to manipulate all of our faces. So with the PolyEffects effector selected, I will start to manipulate the geometry. In this instance, I began to play with a shader effector. That's also one of my go-to and my favorite ones, like the deformer, because you can pipe in C4D's procedural noise, and therefore you have an access to a loop. So again, I'm always thinking about what I'm building out my things in a way where I know it can loop. Otherwise, you'll build something that could look really cool and doesn't work. Doesn't fit the brief, it doesn't work. It doesn't matter. So we'll turn on my position parameters, again, just because I'm going to be looking for a little bit of texture. And I started to play with this position in Z depth and the scale parameter. And like, I don't know, like there's something to me about a really nice looking mesh, and when you see all the polygons building on, it just doesn't get old. I think it looks cool. I like it. I want to see it all the time. And this started to add that element to my scene, which I was liking. However, again, the uniformity is boring. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll start to play around with some of the fall-off options that we have. Firstly, number one being a sphere. And with the fall-off, you can see how you are able to control the strength of the effector and how it manipulates your geometry. So again, this was like super organic process that one thing just sort of, when I'm just sort of playing, sort of leads to another. And I thought this was really, really cool. Now, if we think back to why I'm here, like in the first place, and what I'm doing, I'm just looking for texture, and these faces are occluding the focal point of my design. So how can we customize the fall off even further? So I started to play around in this spline graph. So I'll just add a couple points and select spline preset linear mode to get rid of all of those Bezier handles. At this point, I just want to open up the option to have a whole bunch of points where holding down Command, I can drag as many as I want. So now you can see that when I'm manipulating the fall off, I have like point control over how the values of the strength values of the parameters that I input are affecting the geometry. This is really, really cool, and this is where you start to play, and it gets super, super fun. So I thought, well, now maybe I can stack some of my effectors, and have the sort of effects layer or build upon each other now that I've done some of the hard work. So we'll duplicate my shader, add it to the PolyEffects effector list, and maybe like rotate this one around. Maybe duplicate another one, add it to my PolyEffects, and scale this one up a bit. Oops, that scaled up my, I scaled up my PolyEffects, scaled up our second one, and it was just sort of more, it was more, I guess, sort of how a really good modeler feels when you're just sort of pushing it and pulling the points in a way where you have total control. So I'm just going to flip back to my spatial anomaly matrix that I have and give you a quick render preview of what in final I built. And you can see how these elements of the outer cage just served as, again, texture and just super fine detail. I ended up adding a cloth surface to some of these, the inner points of my cage here, which if I just select my cube, go simulate cloth surface. If I hold down, if I hold down Alt, it'll create the correct parent-child relationship. And you can enter in different varying values of thickness and also subdivide if you're going to be doing a wireframe, so you can get a denser looking mesh with the subdivisions channel here. Anyway, we'll go back to the spatial anomaly matrix. And again, like I really liked this, let's call it secondary level of detail that was added. And I pushed it even further just to have some finer detail. And I duplicated my cube for, let's call it outer cage, made my segments a little bit bigger. And in this time, instead of using the shader effector inside of my poly effects, I used the random effector and again manipulate, or actually I think I don't even manipulate the fall off. I just was looking for some texture. And I just wanted to have a little bit more 3D environmental beauty, if you will. And so I just used the random effector and stacked some of those position and scale values there. And in order to create a nice, soft, shaded fill, I went into the transparency channel and piped in a Fresnel. I like to keep my values at like a 10% off-white, or to a 30 or 40% gray, as 100% white will be transparent. And I just kind of was looking for a softer feel. With a nice blue, and again, I duplicated that texture for my outer shell and made a darker blue. And actually, I'll just delete that and show you I made a darker blue. But when you hit render here, now we're faced back with that problem where some of my outer poly faces are occluding my circuitry. And while I wanted the texture, I didn't want them to obstruct the heartbeat of the piece. So I knew that if I right-click on this cube and add a Cinema 4D display tag, I can completely control the visibility this way. If I toggle the visibility channel on, and I'll turn it down to something like 10, so you can see it's just sort of a nice light dusting, which is exactly what I want. So let's go back and take a look at our final piece. And I'll play out the spatial anomaly matrix. All right. Let's get ready to look at the quantum vehicle chip analysis. Inset in Corey's beautiful UI, I have created an element that I will show you how to make a points pass inside of Cinema 4D, again using the hair render engine, as well as time remapping our render inside of After Effects to create a high-tech, neat-looking scan effect. So here we have my scene file, and I'll just hit NA to get rid of the wireframe there. So we were just getting a clean look at our geometry. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is set up our points pass. So I'll select my 3 pieces of geometry, right-click on the hair tag, add a render tag, and the default mode is surface, of which I am going to change to points. I'll take my length right away down off the top down to a length of 1. We'll do a render preview, and you can see that my points pass is working, as if I enable the verts here, you can see that hair node is being rendered on each one of my vertices. Now I want to keep everything clean and separate. I don't want to see the geometry in my scene. So what I always do is make just a fully transparent material, and I'll drag that onto my, I'll drag that onto my geometry. And when I give you a render preview again, now you can see that I have my points pass totally isolated without any of the geometry. So by default, it gives you a not so pretty brown color. I'm going to want to go ahead and create a new material. Actually, I did right here in the same way that I showed you in the previous example by doing a new shader hair material. And I'll toggle my thickness down to something super, super fine to get a really nice, tight points pass, something like 0.2, and throw a nice blue color into my gradient. I made another one here as well. I probably varied the level of the thickness. Anytime there's an option to do so, I always like to add a little bit of randomness so things don't just feel so global. You can feel it at every level. So if you, I like to do it wherever there's an opportunity to do so. And now you can see that I get a really cool looking detailed points pass of my chip. So I'm going to render that out in one pass. And now I'll take a moment to tell you something else that's super cool, because I think in like R17, Cinema came out with a take system. And this is a perfect example of the take system, where you can just add a new take and set up your points pass, your fill pass, and your wireframe all in one go, and then just render everything once. I am not that eloquent at telling you how to do that, and I didn't want to stumble and make it painful for everybody. So I reference Chad Ashley's tutorial at Grayscale Gorilla all the time, especially because I forget some of the steps. And I encourage you to go over there and listen to him explain how to do that, because he's really good at it. In this example, we're going to do the long road. We're going to take the longhand manual road. And just imagine that we've rendered out our points pass. And the next thing we are going to want to do is create our wireframe. And there's a number of different ways that you can create a wireframe inside of Cinema. I can talk about that probably for an entire presentation, but I, again, don't want to bore you. And in this instance, one that is super quick and like cheap and cheerful, again, it's like less than a second per frame, is using the cell renderer. So I'll go into the Effect tab, enable the cell renderer. We're going to, just right off the bat, enable color mode and edge mode. And just for the sake of visibility, I'll make my edge color white and my background color black. So we'll go into here and give you a quick render preview. And right away, I have, it's rendering the splines of my geometry, which is super cool. You get lucky oftentimes when you're working on cool projects like this too. You get lucky and have like a really detailed, nice looking wireframe, because what makes a wireframe looking cool is the stuff. You want to add stuff to it. Otherwise, you're just looking at a flat shaded surface. So in this piece, though, I knew that what the technology was going to be revealing and scanning was the detail. And I didn't want to give that all away in my first go. So I want to just turn off the edge mode, and we're going to give you a more subtle, unobtrusive wireframe that will just serve as a nice detail and a highlight in our final render. So we'll go back and I'll just play out my scene. I have nested all my geometry under rotate null. So again, we're starting from the ground up. You want to make sure your first thing is covered and that you have a looping element. And remember, we have our points pass. We have our wireframe. The next thing we're going to want to do is have our fill pass. So we are, I'll just take away my fully transparent material, and I just will, again, use a Fresnel inside of the transparency channel. And I think it's also in the Fresnel or the luminance channel for a little bit of a light hit, an extra more of a dramatic light hit, and a nice soft blue in the color channel to blend the two Fresnel objects together. So I'll just go into my, I've already applied the material and make sure that my selection isn't interrupting, and show you how the material is applied to my geometry. I'm going to disable my cell renderer. That could have easily been handled in a new take, but in this case, I'm going to show you, you'll appreciate takes once you do the long route several times. This is how the shader has been applied to the geometry. So we have our 3 passes. And the next thing that, again, I always like to do is set up some nulls so we have access to that in After Effects. And in this case, you saw, like I showed you that in the verts modes, there's many, many verts. And again, we saw the beach ball spinning wheel of death earlier when I cloned, or I think I increased the subdivisions. But again, this is like allows for another area of danger where we don't want to lock up our machine. So a nice cheap trick is to drop a cloner into your scene ahead of time. And what I'm going to do right away, by default, the distribution is put into vertex mode, is I'm going to move my cloner into surface mode, because that way I can limit the count of nulls that will be added to my scene. And in order to I think there was an exploded view of this chip at one point, so that's why I have all my slices separated. But in order to have a global application of those nulls, I'm going to duplicate my slices. Oops, I added a weird render tag. We're going to right-click and say connect objects and delete. And I just call that like a dummy. And I make a dummy null, so therefore, when I pipe my nulls into the object mode of my geometry, the merge dummy is that's what's telling, or that's what the cloner is being told how to assign itself. So I can then add a number, whatever number of different clones that I would like to my geometry, and well, you can do a random seed also for placement if you want to sort of art direct different areas that you know in your mind you'd like to attach graphics to in After Effects. In order to get that data out, like I showed you in the previous example, we're going to right-click on our cloner object, Cinema 4D, add an external compositing tag right there that I had highlighted. I already have one on here. Make sure that the children checkbox is enabled. And in my settings, I'm going to want to make sure that my save checkbox is enabled, included with the 3D data. So we will have rendered out those sequences, and now I'm going to hop back into, or hop over, rather, into After Effects to take an isolated look at what gets brought into After Effects from Cinema. So that's my main comp, and I think at the time we were simplifying everything and just calling these pie pieces. So I'll go into my main pie comp, and when I import my AEC file, I'll just unhide all my nulls. Oops. When I import in my AEC file, you can see how all of my nulls have been imported in here. I had 20, and they're locked to my rendered image sequence. I like to kind of keep that render as light as possible, so we'll concentrate that down. Maybe this was like 100 frames, because at this point, we're going to let After Effects do some of the work for us, and we're going to enable the time remap setting. And I'll just solo my render sequence, and when I do a time remap in After Effects, I imagined in my mind where I thought some cool areas were going to be for the scan, and drop down some keyframes to so I knew where my hold beats were going to be. And working in film, and time is always of the essence, I like to try to steal back as much of that as I can, because it always gets taken from you. So I will copy my time remap. Keyframes, and in the same way that I import it in my RGB, my beauty paths, I'll duplicate on my time remap keys onto my wireframe. So it's pretty small here in this viewport, but here, once I have my elements, they're all on separate layers inside of After Effects. Oops, let's pull out some controls so we can see here. I can play around with different colors. So you can throw out some different looks, I'll just throw a hue and saturation at the bottom or somewhere onto my layer. And you can, you know, if it's like really, really bad, maybe the chip's gonna break later. Well, we can make it red, and we can equally, I could even make a control layer, and we can make both of our passes red, or something like that. Red equals bad. So then, if you recall, the main purpose of this screen is to reveal the inner workings of this piece of tech, and that was in our points pass. So I will, I'll just toggle on, I'll solo only my points pass, which, again, I copied the same time remap keyframes that I generated on my first pass onto my points pass render. And this time, we are going to, this time, I'll just play that out. This time, this is what we are going to want to reveal during those hold frames. And so I used a shape layer, I animated a shape layer, and used it as an alpha matte to serve as the scanning reveal part of my chip. Which, if you appreciate a really good-looking mesh and you're a super nerd about stuff like that, like me, you could spend a long time even just looking at this as an element. I just, like I said, I kind of really enjoy it. So let's unsolo. You can see how I just chopped my points pass segments to be displayed only during the hold frame times that we mapped out inside of my original time remap. Oh, I wish I could make this a little bit bigger for you guys to see. And now it was pretty cool. I was having a lot of fun with things to explore. And I'll just put it in 100%, even though we can't see the whole thing in entirety. What am I going to do with that, with all that null data? And my really good friend, Scott Higgs, is a really smart guy. And he thought about that first. And he developed a plugin called Layer Stalker. I'm just going to open it up so you get familiar with the interface. Check it out on AE Scripts, because before I met him, I was doing everything the long way with two world expressions, and this has totally been a game changer for me when I'm trying to extrapolate and do something with that 3D data. So what we're going to do is just create something really simple to start, like a little number node, and I'll choose my target layer, which brings up a custom palette with all of my layers and my pre-comps. And if we go to my main original Pi pre-comp, you can see that all these data, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all that is, we can access all of that inside this little UI panel inside the pre-comp, and you can go as many pre-comps deep as you want and still get it. So I will effectively stalk the position of said requested layer, and I use layer indices to duplicate. I just duplicate out all of my numbers. So I effectively am. The script is looking at all of my exported data nodes from Cinema and attaching a number to that. Just play out those elements isolated on their own, and so you can see how they are locked in 3D space that match my camera. I love this a lot, and I do it every day. It's great. It's so satisfying once you know how to not have to do it the longhand way. You just want to stalk everything. Super creepy. Anyhow, so those we'll take a quick look. That was all my number tags. And then I just used, again, my really smart friend created a script where I could connect all of my nodes to each other, so I could, again, start to play with some of that spatial data and limit it and constrain it along certain axes, as you see like I did here with these nodes. So going back to our first example, and you can see there's a bit of a pattern here, is like you're always trying to add another layer or another bit of depth to your element without distracting or taking away from the focal point. This one, not being the inner circuitry, but we're doing the reveal of the technology inside of our chip. I thought, well, how can we get some depth back into our scene? Again, like I'm always, it's like a push and pull relationship with just trying to bring things out so it's not so flat, and it just has more visual interest. So I thought, like, this element looks really cool. What if I could have supporting it, or it's like being held in this like suspended sort of computer generated analysis into some sort of a type of a 3D grid. So I hopped back into Cinema and started to play around with some planes. And I'm trying to get better at texturing things, because that is a whole other beast and a true art form. And it's not something that I'm very good, or I'm not patient with it. So I know I totally could have used a bunch of these. I'll just select all these textures that I made. I know I totally could have just like played around with the poly count or the face count on my planes, and gone into edge mode and edge to spline and created a wireframe of my grid element that way. But I was I'm sick and tried to force myself to learn something new, sort of under the gun, and that was working with textures. So I'll show it to you. It's like super basic and very rudimentary. Just a really simple grid inside of Illustrator, and I rendered out that alpha from Illustrator and created a new material in Cinema and imported that texture into my texture channel, and the color, imported that image in the texture drop down in my color channel as well. I copy and paste and put that into my alpha channel. So then actually when I globally apply my texture, Tim Clapham from Hello Lux, I was doing every single one of these the long way, and he was like, "Whoa, you can just select them all at once and do it all in one go." And I was nervous and scared, but he was right, and I did it, and it worked. So I'll select all of my tags that I would like to be applied to those individual planes, and we will go fit to object. And it's sort of a thing, but all my textures hop to their respective planes because they're all a little bit different sizes. And now when I hit render, you can see that the alpha channel and the color channel is reading that cheap and tearful texture. And what I also really like here, because I have a light in the scene, is I'm just for continuity, it sort of blends the two elements together. My grid is not just one hard element. Look at that nice fall off. I didn't even ask for it. It's giving me that nice fall off automatically applied on my scene. Another thing that always has bugged me when I'm playing with textures too in Cinema is the fidelity, and I don't like the aliasing or the jaggies. And after many conversations, I asked one of my friends who I know is very, very good at it, and in the editor tab of our material, you see there's a texture preview size, no scaling. Changed my life. Everything maintains fidelity and is super, super crisp. So a nice little tidbit. Because before you would zoom in and you would go so close to your camera, you would see some of those jaggies, and nobody ever wants jaggies. So that is how I made the secondary, more environmental element. We will just pull up my screen here. That is, oops. Now you can see it just sort of adds, it's like very quiet little piece of texture supporting the main element that I thought brought in a nice bit of depth to the window part of this screen that I thought was missing without it. So lastly, I would like to show you another example where we are going to use object buffers to make custom selections on our geometry in Cinema. And then again, all of these examples that I'm showing you, I'm sort of using the exact same techniques, but I keep layering something that's one thing a little bit different in each one of these. It's all a lot of the same techniques that I am sort of building on each other to add something that is a little bit different. So let's take a look at this 3D part where actually Corey set up this scene, and he's so amazing because he's super clean and organized. So I always love working inside of his files. And again, nested under a rotate null, you have a short image sequence, not to knock on your render time. And what we have here are, because often from production they come in like millions and millions and millions of different pieces, and using a number of different techniques like preserve groups and connect object and merge and replace, you can reduce it down to a manageable amount of geometry. And actually in R20 they have improved all of the import features, which I'm so excited about, because I remember 5 years ago researching painfully how do you bring in CAD files and SolidWorks files, because all of those files are from people that build it and they work in those things. So how can we do something with it here? And R20 is the answer. Because we don't have that right now, we did all of those painful steps. And anyhow, the four pieces that I'll just disable the visibility on. By holding down Alt, you can attack all of your traffic lights. I'll just isolate all. I've got some pipes, and I've got some a little bit of the dressing. There we go. I have a few little bits, engine bits for highlight, and then the outer. Oops, I turned off that now. And then a piece of the outer hull. Now you see the 4 pieces that are in my scene. In order to export all those layers out into passes that you can control individually, we are going to add a Cinema 4D compositing tag, which I think is already on here. And that opens up the object buffer channel. You're going to want to go through each of your individual tags, and yes, you can copy and paste all of them onto respective layers. We're just going to want to make a detailed note of ensuring that each of the checkboxes that are applied here are indexed properly into a unique number. Once we have those 4 buffers set up, we'll go into our multipass tab and add an object buffer layer. You can add as many as you have added into your scene, as many as you want. Oops. I'll just delete these 2, because in this case we just have 4. You need to enable that your group IDs are respective to what your tags, and you can team up. You can say, we want this one to be 1 and 4. You don't always have to just be 4. So that's cool too. So you can combine all that stuff. So let's just remember that for when we're playing around in there. And make sure, in this instance, we'll be simplifying what it is. And I tell you, I just have those 4 that match the 4 in our object manager. And I'm just going to do a frame so you can see what the output. I'll disable the save, make sure we're doing a current frame, and I'll do a Shift R this time. And I don't have the Lightbox Pro kit enabled in this machine. That is okay, because I am just going to show you a single frame here. If I fit to screen, what are the passes that I have set up? in the layer, I'll hop into my layer tab here and go into single pass. You can see that I have my beauty pass. I've got my alpha. In this case, there was a depth pass set up too, which I played with in After Effects, so you can get some really nice tint. You wouldn't get that nice tint if you didn't have that depth there. Again, you can play with depth of field or camera focus. And I have access to, this is what my object buffers look like. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, and now there's 4. So I will just show you, because it was a little bit redundant. I'll show you the screen again. I didn't want to take you back into After Effects and show you the time remapping feature because I just dropped some keyframes in the same way that I showed you with my chip analysis sequence. And here you see in this piece, like I did with the points pass, we've sequenced on this really pretty orange to say like the computer is looking at this parts now, and here now we have found these components, and let's keep calculating. And it's just like a quiet background screen that serves as dressing on the set. It's not saying, look at me, look at me. We're just doing our work. So I see I'm running a little bit long, and that's okay. The last piece that I was going to show you, I'll just do a quick little playthrough, was the atomic fluctuation field, where I wanted to focus in on some hex because we're dealing with WASP, these, honeycomb, that is the technology. And again, I just used the cloner object here in this close-up of what I call the nano hex tech to generate out of a cylinder with reduced segments a denser wireframe. And when I render out the cell render, you can see all those little notches. And I sweeped some NURBS onto the spline here, so we have some rims. And that was just a nice little way that I could easily sneak in some geometry and use the cell renderer to get a more detailed wireframe rendered out of Cinema. So thanks very much for watching. My name is Robin Haddo. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.